She was thrown out of the house by her husband and his family in the middle of the night, in the cold, holding 3 newborn infants, still pink and fragile. They thought she had no one. But what they didn't know was that this woman was the heiress of one of the most powerful dynasties in America. And that night, justice began running toward her. That night, the Boston suburbs lay under a thin veil of mist, every house silent as if fast asleep. But at the old 2-story home at the end of the street, a tragedy quietly cracked open in the darkness. The door burst open with such force that the metal lock rattled violently. Mark Turner, his face flushed with anger, eyes sharp as a blade, dragged his wife, who had given birth to 3 babies only hours earlier, across the doorstep. Sophie Turner, her face still pale from labor, clung desperately to the doorframe but could not fight against her husband's brutal pull. The 3 tiny newborns trembled in her weakened arms. The thin blanket wrapped around them was powerless against the skin-cutting cold of a Boston night. Behind Mark, Barbara, Sophie's mother-in-law, stood with her arms crossed, her expression dripping with disdain. In the corner of the hallway, her brother-in-law, Ethan, leaned against the wall, a mocking smile drawn across his lips. And what froze Sophie to her very bones was the figure of the woman standing behind them. Olivia Pierce, Mark's mistress, wearing a half-smile so light, yet so cruel. Not a single one of them asked if she was okay. Not a single one offered to help her back inside. Mark yanked the door shut, leaving Sophie alone outside, as if he wanted to erase her existence. The lights inside flicked off, swallowing every ounce of warmth behind her. All that remained was Sophie, the 3 infants, and a night so cold it suffocated. Sophie struggled to pull in a fragile breath, her legs trembling, no longer strong enough to keep her standing. She collapsed onto the wooden porch steps, pulling the 3 babies tightly against her chest with the last bit of strength she had left. In that moment, no one knew that the woman the Turner family had belittled, humiliated, and thrown out like discarded trash was carrying a secret so immense it could bring all of them down. A secret that would completely change Sophie's life and the lives of those who cast her into this freezing night. The night wind swept through rows of bare maple trees, carrying a cold that cut through skin. Sophie shivered, not entirely because of the freezing air, but because of the brutal reality closing in on her. She had been abandoned, treated like a burden, something disposable, the moment someone no longer wanted to take responsibility. And the Turner family believed Sophie had no one on her side. But the truth, as always, was never as simple as it appeared. Sophie Turner, the name everyone in the neighborhood knew her by, was only a quiet shell she had chosen for herself, a way to live a simple life. Her real name, the name Mark had signed on the marriage license but never once cared about, was Sophie Whitman, the only daughter of Jonathan Whitman, the man behind the famed Whitman real estate empire, a name that made financiers from Boston to New York take caution the moment they heard it. But no one in the Turner family knew that. No one knew why Sophie walked away from wealth, why she chose a life counting every dollar, cooking humble meals, and quietly hoping for the love she believed she had found. As she curled up on the porch, freezing, a distant memory replayed in her mind like a slow-motion reel. She was 17, standing in the marble hall of the Whitman mansion. She had told her father, her voice soft but unwavering, "I want to be loved for who I am, not for the name Whitman." The man had looked at her with gentle, yet deeply understanding eyes. "Then keep the name on paper," he said, "so I can still protect you. But your real life, let that be yours to choose." Back then, Sophie didn't fully understand, but now, abandoned in the cold Boston night, His words echoed in her mind like a prophecy she never saw coming. Her father had known that one day someone would try to hurt her, and he had prepared everything: financial alert systems, fraud monitoring triggers, quiet legal mechanisms, waiting only to activate in a moment of crisis. Tonight, Mark Turner had unknowingly set off that entire chain. In recent months, drunk on infatuation with another woman and blinded by his own recklessness, Mark had used Sophie's name to withdraw money, pay hotel bills, and buy things she had never seen. He thought no one knew, but the Whitman system knew. And when the final fraudulent transaction was made, the protective network activated instantly, pinpointing the Turner home address and sending alerts to the family's legal team. While Mark slammed the door and popped champagne inside, 2 black SUVs were already racing down misty streets, headlights slicing the night like blades of ice. They were coming not only because Sophie was in danger, but because someone had touched the one boundary the Whitman family had sworn to defend at any cost. Sophie, of course, knew none of this. She only knew her breath was growing weaker, her trembling arms tightening around her crying newborns, and the pain in her abdomen tearing through her body. She lifted her eyes to the pitch-black sky, tears blurring her vision, and whispered a fragile plea. "Please, someone help me." A voice as small as a gust of wind, yet it was the moment that shifted her entire life. Because just minutes later, the blinding white headlights of an SUV illuminated the Turner porch. The car door opened, and a deep, familiar voice from her childhood cut through the cold. "Miss Whitman, we've found you." The white headlights from the SUV swept across the porch, illuminating Sophie's trembling figure as she clutched all 3 infants to her chest. She squinted at the light, her heart beating weakly, yet suddenly an inexplicable sensation rose within her. Something familiar, safe, warm, appearing at the very moment her world seemed darkest. The car door opened and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, his black suit dusted with mist. Sophie blinked, focusing, and then she recognized that face, sharp, composed, with unwavering eyes she could never mistake. Robert Hale, chief of security for the Whitman dynasty, was the man who had followed her through childhood like a silent guardian shadow. His voice was so deep and steady that Sophie nearly broke into tears. "Miss Whitman, we've been looking for you for a long time." In that instant, everything she had spent years hiding, her bloodline, her identity, her father's protection, rose to the surface clearer than ever. Robert hurried over, kneeling beside Sophie. His thick coat was immediately draped over her and the infants. Sophie's entire body nearly collapsed into his arms the moment that warmth touched her. 2 nurses jumped out from the back seats, rushing toward her. They gently lifted the 3 babies from the mother's weakened embrace and wrapped them in specialized thermal blankets. Sophie exhaled shakily, her eyes blurring, not from pain, but because for the first time in months, she felt genuine care. Robert looked at her with a tightly held fury, not directed at her, but at what had been done to her. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice so low the wind seemed to fall silent. Sophie forced her lips to move, but only fragmented words slipped out. "They threw me out with the babies." Robert did not reply, but in his eyes a violent storm was already forming. Another figure approached, Grant Whitman, the family attorney and also Sophie's distant cousin. He didn't speak immediately. He took in the scene, the blood spots, Sophie's bare feet, the weak cries of the now warmed newborns, and the Turner house door slammed shut as if to hide all guilt inside. When he finally lifted his head, there was no shock left in his expression, only a cold, deliberate resolve. "Activate full Whitman protection," he said briskly. Record the entire scene, the whole front of the house, timestamp everything, and pull video feeds from neighboring homes. Each command cut the air like a blade. Sophie looked at these men she thought she had walked away from long ago. She had once chosen an ordinary life, believing she needed no protection from her powerful lineage. But at that moment, as Robert steadied her shoulders and Grant ordered the preservation of evidence, Sophie realized her father had never abandoned her for even a second. He had foreseen this fall and built a protective net strong enough to lift her the instant the world turned its back on her. When Robert lifted Sophie into his arms, her body felt suddenly weightless, not because she lacked strength, but because she no longer had to hold herself up alone. The 3 infants were placed into the medical compartment inside the SUV, their breathing stabilized, warmth returning to their tiny bodies. Sophie glanced toward the house through the car window and, for a split second, through the narrow gap in the curtains, she saw Barbara's silhouette retreat quickly, like someone terrified that the light of truth might touch her. Inside, Mark was still sitting in the living room, raising a glass of wine with Olivia, completely unaware that his life had just begun to collapse. The SUV door shut, sealing out the freezing air, and the vehicle rolled forward into the night. Sophie leaned her head back against the seat, tears slipping down her cheeks, not from pain, not from despair, but for one single reason. At last, she had been found. The SUV sped out of the quiet neighborhood, leaving behind the lone yellow glow spilling from the Turner house, the place that had just buried one life and awakened another. Inside the vehicle, warmth from the specialized medical system spread outward, and for the first time, Sophie felt her hands weren't cold as stone. Her 3 babies lay peacefully in their warming pods, their tiny breaths steadier now, their once purple skin gradually returning to a gentle, healthy pink. Sophie's chest tightened as she watched them, not from pain, but from knowing the moment she lost them had passed, and the moment she would protect them had come. Robert sat across from her, his eyes never leaving Sophie even for a second. He had seen her cry at age 7 after falling from the marble steps of the Whitman estate, had seen her shiver during winter horseback lessons, had seen her smile like sunlight the day she said she wanted an everyday life. But he had never seen Sophie like this, exhausted yet unbroken, betrayed yet still dignified. Somehow it was this quiet, resilient tenderness that made Robert clench his fists. "You're safe now, Sophie," he said softly, his deep voice echoing like old wooden floors in the night. "No one has the right to touch you again." Grant sat beside the driver, reviewing data on the tablet, photos of the scene, Mrs. Thompson's video, fraudulent transactions from the Whitman accounts, and the file Mark had foolishly left on the dining table. The blue glow of the screen reflected across Grant's face, giving him a sternness Sophie rarely saw. When she looked up, Grant turned back and spoke gently, though his words were sharp and merciless. "They've thrown themselves into the abyss, Sophie. Our job is to document everything as clearly as possible." But Sophie didn't answer right away. She was staring out the window, watching buildings fade behind them, watching familiar streets blur like a painful memory dissolving into fog. In that suspended silence, a question surged through her mind. Why did she have to go through all of this? How could love turn into cruelty? How could the person she trusted most become the one who threw her out of her own home? She placed a hand on her abdomen, the place that had once carried 3 tiny lives, now the very reason she was still here. "You're okay," she whispered, as if speaking to herself. "You still have your mother." The car turned onto the road leading to the Whitman Medical Suite, a private healthcare facility known only to a handful of families in the country. This was where her father had been treated during his final months, As the pure white building appeared in the distance, Sophie felt as if she were stepping from a long night into her first dawn. The door opened and everyone moved instantly, like a rescue team that had trained for this moment 100 times. Nurses retrieved the warming pods, and neonatal specialists rushed over to check each tiny breath. Robert helped Sophie out of the vehicle, his hand so steady that for the first time, she allowed herself to lean on someone. The hospital corridor was silent, lit softly, without the harsh antiseptic smell of public hospitals. Instead, there was a faint lavender scent, her mother's favorite. When Sophie was finally laid on the hospital bed, she exhaled deeply, a breath she might have been holding since the moment she was pushed out of her home. Doctors examined her, nurses adjusted the blanket, and soon only Robert and Grant remained. Grant stepped closer, placing the tablet at the foot of the bed. His voice was gentle, but his words carried the weight of a turning world. "Sophie, there's something you need to know." The moment the hospital confirmed the birth of the triplets, every protective clause your father set up activated automatically. The estate, the legal authority, and everything belonging to the Whitman family is now transferred to you. Tonight doesn't just mark betrayal. It marks the moment you rise with all the strength you've always had. Sophie closed her eyes as 2 tears rolled down, not from weakness. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw her father, his warm smile, his gentle voice, his large hand on her childhood hair. "Dad," she whispered, "you prepared me for far more than I ever realized." And in that moment, the fear inside her began to fade, replaced by something else. Not yet anger, but strong enough to push her forward. A clarity, steady and silent like a newly lit flame. She opened her eyes, looked at Grant and Robert, and though her voice was weak, it was unmistakably firm. "What do we do next?" Grant answered with a thin smile, his gaze filled with respect. "First step, Sophie, is to let the truth speak." The hospital room was so quiet Sophie could hear every breath she took. Short, weak, but steadier than on the Turner porch. Warm yellow light fell across her pale face, bringing a faint flush back to cheeks that had lost all color. Her 3 infants lay in the glass room beside her, nurses monitoring them minute by minute. They were so peaceful that it made Sophie's throat tighten. They had no idea that just hours ago they had been torn from the warmth of this world in the cruelest possible way. Grant returned to the room carrying his familiar tablet. He placed it gently on Sophie's lap, but didn't open it yet. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment, as if making sure she was ready to face what she was about to see. "Sophie," he said softly but with weight, "this video, you have the right not to watch it. We can handle the rest." Sophie shook her head slowly. Her eyes were tired, but within them glimmered a resolve she herself had never seen before. "No, I need to know everything." Grant nodded, then opened the video. The first image to appear was the Turner porch. Yellow light from inside spilt out, illuminating the way Mark yanked the door. Then Sophie's staggering figure emerged, holding the 3 babies still smeared with birth blood. Barbara's voice rang out, sharp and metallic. "She can give birth on her own. She always exaggerates everything." Olivia leaned against the doorframe, lips slightly curled, as if watching entertainment rather than witnessing a mother's suffering. Ethan crossed his arms, eyes indifferent. Then came the moment Mark shoved Sophie outside, so hard her legs buckled beneath her, followed by her desperate, broken gasp for air. Sophie raised a hand to her mouth, trying to stifle the sob rising in her throat. But what crushed her wasn't the brutality itself. It was how all of them, together, without hesitation, turned their backs on her at the weakest moment of her life. Mark turned and slammed the door shut as if erasing a burden. The video stopped on the frame of Sophie collapsed on the steps, arms tightening around the babies to hold on to the last bit of warmth she had. It was an image no mother should ever endure, and no human being should ever deserve. Rachel Cross appeared at the doorway holding a digitized folder. She stepped forward, her voice clear but respectful. "These are the files Mark left behind. We restored the originals from his and Olivia's emails and storage history." Sophie looked down at the printed pages. They were so familiar that her stomach twisted. Cold, calculated plans. Financial isolation, psychological smear tactics, reputation control, emotional entrapment. Hotel invoices Mark had paid using accounts under her name, withdrawals she had never known about. Even a DNA test request Olivia had filed to make sure the triplets aren't Mark's. Sophie didn't cry anymore. Some pain is so deep that tears can no longer express it. She stared at each page as if looking at the final chapter of a once beautiful dream she had tried so hard to hold on to. Grant sat beside her, his voice warm again. "Sophie, you weren't wrong to love. You weren't wrong to trust. But what they did to you, this is no longer just betrayal. This is a crime." Sophie closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she saw the Turner porch, the lights going out, the wind cutting across the wooden steps. Then she saw her 3 children, warm, safe inside the incubators. 2 opposing worlds, one of ruthless darkness and one of life's brightest light. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer the trembling woman on the porch. Something had changed in them. The pain was still there, but beneath it, something new had been lit. Clarity, will, strength. "Grant," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I want to take them to court. All of them. No hiding anything." Grant tilted his head slightly as if confirming the certainty behind her words. "Not just court," she continued, her gaze sharpening. "The whole world needs to know what they did." Robert stood by the door glancing at Grant. When their eyes met, both understood. This wasn't the voice of a victim anymore. It was the voice of a Whitman heir, a mother, a woman who had survived unimaginable cruelty and chosen to rise. Grant closed the tablet, his expression softening, his voice low and sure. "Then we begin tonight." And in that moment, Sophie knew the path she was stepping onto was not just about reclaiming justice for herself, but about teaching those who threw her into darkness one undeniable truth. They had gravely underestimated the woman they thought was weak. Dawn had just broken, the Boston sky turning into the pale gray of a winter morning. Cold swept across the mist-covered rooftops, but inside the SUV parked by the curb, the air was thick with a tense silence. Grant checked his watch, then gave Robert a subtle nod. "It's time." Robert opened the door and stepped out, his stride heavy, steady. Not threatening, but the kind of walk belonging to someone who knows he is carrying justice into the home of a man who touched what should never have been touched. They stopped before the Turner house, a place once believed to be a home, now nothing more than an empty shell filled with traces of betrayal. The kitchen light was still on. Mark had stayed up late, perhaps thinking life was opening ahead of him, believing that throwing Sophie out meant freedom. He had no idea that every moment of despair Sophie once felt was now shifting onto him. Robert pressed the doorbell. The chime rang clear and sharp, slicing through the false peace inside the house. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then the door snapped open. Mark appeared, wearing a crumpled hoodie, face groggy and annoyed. When he saw Robert, a tall man in a black suit flanked by two legal officers, Mark froze. Clearly, he was not accustomed to facing actual power. "Who are you?" he snapped, though his voice carried an unmistakable tremor of uncertainty. Robert didn't answer the question. He looked at Mark with a calm, frozen lake gaze. Beside him, the process server stepped forward, speaking clearly. "Mr. Mark Turner, by request of our client, Sophie Whitman, this is your legal service, including divorce petition, child custody petition, request for account freeze, identity fraud investigation file, and a restraining order." Each document was presented neatly, formally, and cold as steel. Mark laughed, a brittle sound echoing like something hollow breaking. "Whitman, you've got the wrong person. Sophie has no family, no money, no—" He stopped. Suddenly, that name, Whitman, made something snap inside him. He grabbed the packet, eyes darting across the pages. When he saw the small Whitman crest printed in the corner, his face drained of color in an instant. "No. No way," Mark whispered, stumbling back a step. His legs visibly shook. A sound rustled behind him. Barbara appeared in her bathrobe, scowling. "What's going on here?" She snatched a document from Mark's hands, her eyes scanning the bold print. 1 second. Just 1 second was enough for her knees to buckle onto the chair behind her. "Whitman." She stared at Mark, disbelief twisting her features. You married a woman and didn't even know who she was?" Ethan hovered behind them, eyes wide. For the first time in his life, he seemed to understand that their family had crossed the wrong person. Mark tried to regain composure. I can explain. Sophie will talk to me." His breath grew uneven, frantic, as if even he didn't believe his own words. Robert stepped forward, just 1 step, but enough to make Mark swallow hard. His voice wasn't loud, but it was forged of iron. "You threw her out of the house on the coldest night of the year. You made her give birth to 3 children on the floor without calling for help. You used her name for financial fraud." Robert tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharp enough to force Mark's eyes downward. "You thought that wouldn't have consequences?" Mark said nothing. His throat tightened. His hands shook as he clutched the folder. Olivia emerged from inside, running her fingers through her hair, trying to maintain her usual confidence. But when she saw Robert, saw the Whitman crest, saw Mark's pale face, she stepped back. I'm not involved," she stammered. I just... The sentence died on her tongue. Grant stepped forward from behind Robert, holding another envelope. "Ms. Pierce," he said, his tone polite like a formal greeting, yet pronounced in a way that made Olivia freeze. "Inside this is the recovered record of your internal messages with Mark. Messages encouraging him to force Sophie out after childbirth. We will be submitting everything to the court." Olivia seemed to deflate. She nearly collapsed right there at the doorstep. Mark stepped forward, his voice cracking. I didn't know she was a Whitman. If I had known then... Grant looked at him for a long moment, then delivered a sentence that chilled the porch air more than the winter wind ever could. "You didn't need to know who she was. You only needed to know she was a human being." And that was the one thing Mark had never understood. Robert turned back and signaled to his team. "We're done." As he stepped off the Turner porch, the morning wind rustled the documents trembling in Mark's hands. But only Mark knew. It wasn't the wind. It was fear, finally flooding his entire chest. For the first time since he shoved Sophie out of that house, Mark Turner understood that his life was about to change, and not in any way he had wanted. It would change in the exact way he had sown it, with his own 2 hands. That morning, the Boston District Court was so crowded that there wasn't a single empty spot left in the hallway. Reporters pressed against the steps outside, cameras flashing non-stop like lightning in a winter storm. People whispered among themselves, rumors spreading like fire. That's the Turner case. I heard the wife is a Whitman. Whitman? That Whitman? Exactly. And they have video. When the courtroom doors opened, the atmosphere tightened like a drawn bowstring. Mark Turner entered first, followed by his attorney. His face was pale, his clothes wrinkled as if he hadn't slept a single second the night before. Barbara and Ethan walked behind him, trying to appear composed, but their darting eyes betrayed their panic. Olivia sat in the back row wearing dark sunglasses to hide her fear. They no longer looked like the confident, arrogant family from the night Sophie was thrown out. They looked like people awaiting a verdict on their own lives. Then the courtroom fell silent, completely still, as if a cold wind had swept through every person. The door at the back opened and Sophie Whitman walked in. She wore a simple cream sweater, her hair falling softly around her face, still slightly pale from the difficult birth. But her eyes were no longer those of a woman pushed into the darkness. They were bright, steady, and deep, like someone who had just reclaimed herself. Walking beside her was Grant, carrying a thick stack of documents. Behind them was Robert, his posture straight and silent like a steel wall. When Sophie took her seat at the plaintiff's table, the entire courtroom exhaled as one, not out of fear, but out of something closer to awe. The sight of that small, fragile woman standing again after everything she had endured was something no one could ignore. Judge Avery entered. He looked at the file once, then looked at both sides. This is an emergency hearing regarding custody of the 3 newborn infants, the safety of the mother, and allegations involving financial fraud and abandonment, he said clearly. Let us begin. Grant stood. He didn't raise his voice, didn't show aggression. He opened his tablet and projected a video onto the large screen in the center of the room. Your Honor, the first piece of evidence. The screen lit up with the footage taken by Mrs. Thompson. The Turner porch appeared, Sophie clutching her 3 infants as the cold wind lashed against her pale skin, the weak cries of the babies tearing through the night. Barbara's voice rang out, sharp as a blade. She can give birth on her own. Then Mark slammed the door, the sound hitting the courtroom like a cruel verdict. The video replayed the moment Sophie collapsed onto the steps, her tears mixing with drops of blood on the wooden floor. No one said a word. Several people covered their mouths. A female reporter in the back row even burst into tears. When the video ended, Judge Avery placed his hands together and exhaled sharply as if restraining his own anger. Grant continued presenting evidence. Hotel bills Mark paid through accounts under Sophie's name, unauthorized withdrawals, the plan to strip Sophie of her rights, annotated by Olivia and Barbara. Each piece of evidence fell like a hammer breaking through the Turner family's excuses. Mark's lawyer stood, voice trembling. Your Honor, my client. He did not know she was... The judge cut him off immediately. Do you believe her identity is more important than the inhumane conduct captured on that video? This is a courtroom, not a place to justify cruelty. Mark turned to Sophie, eyes red, voice shaking to the point of breaking. Sophie, please say something. I'm sorry. But Sophie remained silent. Not a word, not a nod, not even a tear. And it was that silence that destroyed Mark. Judge Avery set down his pen and delivered a ruling in a voice no one could mistake. The court grants full custody of the 3 infants to Sophie Whitman. A restraining order is issued, preventing Mark Turner and all family members from approaching her or the children within 500 feet. All related accounts are to be frozen pending investigation. Fraud and child endangerment files will be forwarded to the district attorney. The gavel struck. A single strike, yet enough to end an entire chapter of life. Mark collapsed into his seat, arms hanging helplessly. Barbara turned away, trying to hide her shame. Olivia buried her face, knowing her career was over. Ethan stared at the floor like a child caught stealing. But Sophie didn't look at them. She rose slowly, her hand unconsciously resting over her heart, as if reminding herself that it was still beating, still alive, still full of hope. She walked out of the courtroom, not to run from the past, but to step into the future she had reclaimed with her own pain. That afternoon, the steps of the Boston courthouse were flooded with people. Cameras, microphones, reporters shouting over each other, live news banners from major networks. Everything blended into a noisy electric storm that could be felt in the air itself. News of the case spread faster than any wind sweeping across the central square. The name Sophie Whitman appeared everywhere, on phones, news sites, and a non-stop stream of tweets. The courthouse doors burst open, and Mark Turner rushed out first, as if trying to escape the room where his world had fallen apart. Dozens of microphones immediately thrust toward him, forcing him to stumble back, overwhelmed by flashes that crackled like lightning. "Mark Turner, did you really throw your wife out while she was in labor? Why did you use her accounts for personal spending? What do you have to say about the video? What went through your mind when you learned your wife was a Whitman?" The questions tangled together like a wire cage tightening around his throat. Mark raised a hand to hide his face, but he couldn't escape. Every question was a blade, every flash a cut to the ego of a man who once thought he held power. "Get away from me," he shouted, voice hoarse, but no one moved. He shoved a microphone aside, nearly knocking over a camera operator. The crowd erupted. "Baby abandoner! He should be in jail. No one believes your lies anymore." Backing away, Mark collided with Olivia, who stood near the bottom step looking disheveled, her hands shaking like leaves. "Olivia?" Mark called, almost pleading. But Olivia avoided his eyes, stepping further back as she whispered, "I can't be tied to you anymore. You did this. You deal with it." Reporters swarmed her instantly. Olivia paled, shielding half her face before bolting down the steps like she was fleeing danger. Barbara came out next, but the moment she saw the sea of cameras, she turned her fury on Mark, as if every sin in existence was suddenly his fault. "Look at this," she hissed. "The family is destroyed. Our reputation was dragged through the mud. This is all on you." Ethan followed, refusing to meet his brother's eyes, muttering, I told you not to let this go that far." But all these sounds faded when the crowd fell abruptly silent. A wave of stillness spread through them, soft but powerful enough to stop every voice. Reporters turned instinctively. A woman stepped through the courthouse doors, moving slowly as if the moment belonged to her alone. Sophie emerged with a calm that no camera could fully capture. She wore a soft cream sweater, her lengthy hair falling gently over her shoulders. Her eyes glowed under the cold Boston sunlight. In her arms was one of her babies, wrapped in a white blanket, sleeping peacefully. 2 nurses followed behind, carrying the other infants as if they held priceless treasures. No one needed to speak. No one dared. Sophie's presence made the entire crowd hold its breath. Mark turned. His face crumpled, his lips trembling as if he wanted to speak but couldn't form the words. He took one step forward, then another, like a drowning man reaching for his last hope. "Sophie." His voice cracked, no longer sounding like a man at all but a desperate soul. "Please, look at me. I'm sorry. I didn't know. Sophie stopped a few steps away from him. She didn't move forward. She didn't retreat. She stood still, something she had learned from pain. That sometimes the most significant strength is not in striking, but in refusing to waver. Mark collapsed onto his knees right there on the courthouse steps, his forehead almost touching the stone. "Sophie, I'm begging you. Don't take the children from me." His voice splintered like an old wooden floor soaked in rain. Reporters edged closer with their cameras, but no one dared step between the two of them. Sophie gently adjusted the blanket around the sleeping baby in her arms, a small, tender gesture that silenced the entire crowd. Then she looked at Mark, not with accusation, but with the gaze of someone who had walked through the most profound suffering and come out the other side. "Mark," she said, her voice soft as breath but ringing like silver in the stillness. "You pushed us into the coldest night. But it was in that night I realized I no longer belonged where you stand." Mark lifted his head, panic flooding his eyes. "Please, please don't leave." Sophie shook her head, not with bitterness, not with spite, just finality. She turned and descended the courthouse steps with her 3 children safely protected. Robert walked behind her, forming a shield around them. Grant walked ahead, clearing the path through a crowd that watched in awed silence. Cameras followed every step, missing nothing. No more jeers, no more whispers. Only admiration. Because everyone understood. They were witnessing the rise of a woman the world once thought was weak. And from that moment on, the name Sophie Whitman was no longer just a headline. It became the symbol of a truth everyone knows, but few dare to say aloud. Not everyone thrown into darkness stays there. Some rise and carry the light with them. The days following the trial became a whirlwind that the entire country watched. The story of the woman thrown out of her home in the freezing night with 3 newborn infants ignited social media, evening news shows, and even made front-page headlines of major newspapers. Yet in the midst of all that noise, Sophie Whitman chose silence. She stayed temporarily within the Whitman estate grounds, a peaceful place surrounded by forest and white stone paths she used to run along as a child. Each morning sunlight streamed through her window, gently waking the 3 babies sleeping in small cradles beside her bed. Every time she looked at them, Sophie felt her heart piece itself back together, bit by bit, fragment by fragment. Some afternoons, Robert brought security reports, standing quietly for a moment before leaving, as if wanting to make sure she was okay. Some days, Grant spent hours explaining the next legal steps, but always ended with the same reassurance. "You don't have to fight alone anymore." Rachel visited often, helping Sophie reorganize her new life and sort through financial records and assets she suddenly had to take responsibility for. Sophie didn't boast, didn't seek revenge, didn't stir up chaos. She did only one thing. She took steady steps toward the life she should have had long ago. One afternoon, as light snow drifted over Boston, Sophie carried one of her babies out onto the balcony. Snowflakes landed on her hand, melting immediately, like the warmth of her own soul, a warmth she once thought had vanished the night the Turner door slammed shut. But now, in her arms was not darkness, but the bright future of these 3 tiny lives. She whispered, "You came into this world in a storm, but I promise I will lead you into the morning light." Sophie's phone vibrated. A message from Grant. "We've completed the final documents. You need to sign." She looked at the screen for a moment, then smiled, a smile so warm that even falling snow wasn't cold enough to extinguish it. The signing took less time than she expected. When everything was submitted, Grant gathered the files, then paused. He looked at Sophie with sincerity in his eyes. "Sophie, there's something you must remember. Your strength doesn't come from being a Whitman. You're strong because you are you." Sophie didn't respond, but her eyes grew glossy. It was the first time she had heard a reminder that her heart truly accepted. That night, after putting the babies to sleep, Sophie sat in her quiet room thinking over the past days. No more howling wind. No more slamming doors. No more cruel laughter from the man who once lay beside her. Only the gentle breaths of 3 small lives. Lives that made her choose to keep living. And to live stronger. She took out a small notebook and wrote on the first page, "Day 1 of a new life." Then she added another line, a reminder to herself. Being cast into darkness is not the end. Sometimes it's simply how life opens another door. When Sophie closed the notebook, she looked outside the window. The snow had stopped. The sky was clearer. Lights shimmered faintly among the trees like stars caught on the ground. And strangely, for the first time after a long road full of tears, Sophie no longer feared the future. She whispered, as a promise not just to herself but to anyone who had ever been hurt as she was. There are battles we don't choose, but through them, we learn to find the strength we never knew we carried. Then she stood, adjusted the blanket over the babies, and placed a soft kiss on each tiny forehead. "We're okay now," she whispered. "I promise." Downstairs, the hallway light clicked on softly. Robert stood there, catching sight of Sophie's shadow passing by. He said nothing, but inside him, a profound respect rose for the woman no storm had ever managed to break. Sophie Whitman lost everything in one night. But that same night, she found herself again. And sometimes, as life quietly whispers to those who have fallen, the strongest light always appears after the darkest moment. A few weeks after the trial, the atmosphere at Whitman Estate grew unusually warm. Even though winter still covered the stone paths in thick snow, the main house was filled with soft laughter, the gentle chime of infant warmers, and the hurried footsteps of nurses during their shifts. There was no trace left of the horrific nights Sophie had endured. Everything had been replaced by a sense of safety so deep that even her breathing felt softer. But this peace was not a retreat. It was the beginning of something else. Rebirth. Sophie had begun light therapy sessions at Rachel's suggestion, not because she was weak, but because she chose to heal herself to become stronger. In those sessions, Sophie spoke words she had kept inside for years. Her fear of abandonment, her belief that she was never enough, her naive trust in love, and the guilt she carried for enduring suffering for so long. For the first time, hearing those truths spoken aloud felt like releasing a heavy stone from her chest. Grant visited every morning to update her on the progress of the subsequent lawsuit against Mark and the others. "You don't need to worry about anything," he always said. "We'll handle it all." But Sophie discovered something new. She no longer wanted to stand outside her own life. One morning, as Grant was about to leave, Sophie called after him, her voice gentle but firm. "I want to participate in the meetings about my assets. It's my father's legacy, and now it's my responsibility." Grant stopped, looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. A proud, relieved smile. "I've been waiting for you to say that." Robert kept a respectful distance, but his care never dimmed. Every time Sophie carried the eldest baby down to the garden, Robert stood several meters away, not close enough to intrude, but close enough to respond instantly if anything happened. Sophie realized his presence made her feel safe in a different way. Not the safety of power, but the safety of someone who sincerely wanted to protect her. One afternoon, when the snow finally stopped and the sun peeked through the clouds, Sophie wrapped herself in a scarf and carried one baby to the west garden, the place with the wooden bench where her father used to read. She sat down gently, settling the baby in her lap and watching the small, round eyes struggle to open and take in the new world. "I don't know who I'm going to become anymore," she whispered. "But I know I will never again be someone anyone can trample on." The wind moved through the branches, carrying the scent of snow and earth, like nature itself was offering its quiet approval. In that peaceful moment, Sophie realized the most essential truth. She no longer lived to prove anything to anyone. Not to Mark, not to those who doubted her. She lived for herself, for her 3 children, and for the values her father had taught her: kindness, strength, and never forgetting who she truly was. That night, before going to bed, Sophie stood before the mirror in the large room. She realized mirrors didn't just reflect appearance, they reflected journeys. She looked at herself, not at her face or her hair, but into her eyes. Eyes that had once been so fragile the night she was pushed out of her home. Now, steady as steel forged through fire. She murmured, as if greeting an old friend returning after a long absence, "Welcome back, Sophie." On another floor, in the estate's study, Grant and Robert sat before a screen displaying news updates. The names Mark Turner, Barbara, and Olivia appeared across multiple investigative reports. More complaints had been filed with the court. After a long moment, Grant switched off the screen. He folded his arms, gazing out the window toward the light glowing from Sophie's room. "She's changed," he said. Robert replied without looking away from that same warm light. "No, she's just finally returned to who she always was." And that, more than any revenge, it was the most significant victory. That night, Whitman Estate lay in an unusual stillness. The moon hung high in the sky, its silver light washing over every stone on the walkway, every branch sleeping beneath a thin layer of snow. Inside the spacious but warm room, Sophie sat quietly beside the large cradle where her 3 babies slept peacefully. Their steady breaths formed a gentle lullaby, calming her mind after weeks of upheaval. She placed a hand on the edge of the cradle, gazing at 3 tiny faces, 3 closed eyelids, 3 fragile hearts beating in the quiet of the night. People said newborns remembered nothing, but Sophie believed the love and pain a mother endured to protect them would live on in their hearts somehow, forever. After everything, she realized what kept her standing wasn't money, nor the power of the Whitman name, nor even outrage against cruelty. It was that moment she held her trembling children in her arms on the night she was abandoned. The moment that gave her a reason to rise. Not for revenge, but to live. Sophie left the room as softly as if she feared waking the babies, then walked down the hallway toward the estate's grand library. The room was dark, but moonlight through the windows lit up the walnut bookshelves her father once cherished. She approached his old writing desk, where his fountain pen and leather notebook still rested, as they had in his final days. Sophie sat down, and instinctively her hand rested on the notebook, as though reaching for a connection that transcended time. She opened it. On the last page was a single line her father had written before he passed. "My daughter, if one day you feel lost, remember, I do not leave you wealth. I leave you the courage to choose your life again." Sophie closed her eyes. A tear slid silently onto the edge of the page, not a tear of sorrow, but of understanding. For the first time, she felt it clearly. She had not just survived. She had changed. She was no longer the trembling woman who stepped onto the Turner porch. She had become a woman who knew her worth. The woman her father believed would remain standing, even when the world tried to break her. She closed the notebook, pressed a gentle kiss to its worn leather cover, and whispered, "I won't disappoint you." When she stood, she saw her reflection in the library's window. It was no longer the image of her past self. The face was steadier, the eyes deeper, the stance firmer. The gentleness was still there, but it was no longer prolonged weakness. It was the gentleness of someone who knew exactly how strong she had become. She returned to the hallway where soft golden lights illuminated each of her steps. At the far end, Robert stood guard in silence. When Sophie approached, he tilted his head slightly, asking nothing, demanding nothing, only looking at her with the eyes of someone witnessing the transformation of a soul. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice deep and quiet like the earth. Sophie smiled, a real smile, a smile she once believed she would never have again. "Yes," she replied, "for the first time in a very long while. I truly am." Robert looked at her for a moment, then bowed his head. "I'm glad to hear that." Sophie walked past him, but before she moved too far, she paused, turned back, and spoke a sentence that warmed the entire corridor. "Thank you for finding me, right when I thought no one ever would." Robert didn't reply. He placed a hand over his heart and bowed. It was his way of saying, "I will always be there." Sophie continued walking. Each step is a declaration. She had returned to herself. And this time, no one would ever push her into the darkness again. One winter morning, as Boston gently awakened, soft sunlight filtered through the snow-covered branches. Sophie stood on the steps of Whitman estate, holding her youngest child in her arms. The other two were still sleeping in the warm glass nursery behind her. The breeze brushed past her hair, carrying the scent of a new beginning, clear, gentle, and full of hope. She looked far toward the horizon, where the first light of day touched the white snow, creating a shimmering reflection like a lake coming to life. A month ago, she had stood in the darkness, frozen and desperate, cast out by the very person she loved most. Today, she stood here, on the land her father left her, a woman who had rediscovered her own worth. No reporters, no gavels, no chaos of public opinion. Only the soft heartbeat of the baby in her arms and the peaceful rhythm of her own breath. Robert stood a few steps away, silent as always, not watching with the eyes of a guard, but with the eyes of someone witnessing the rising of a soul. Grant stepped out of the doorway holding a few documents, but when he saw Sophie gazing at the sky, he stopped. There are moments when even a man of law understands that laws, no matter how powerful, cannot reach the depth a human heart can achieve after surviving pain. Sophie gently stroked the baby's forehead, and for the first time she spoke aloud a truth she had realized through all these days, a truth everyone needs to hear at least once in their life. Not everyone who leaves our lives is a loss. Some leave so that the strongest version of ourselves can finally walk in. Her words melted into the cold air, yet felt as though they were carved onto the morning sky. She walked inside, closing the door softly behind her. The house warmed as if welcoming her home. A new family was being built, not from perfection, but from pieces once thought broken that were really waiting for the right hands to put them back together. 3 babies slept peacefully. Her heart rested, and the future ahead was wide open. Not because she was lucky, not because she was wealthy, but because she had found the most important thing of all: faith in herself. There are wounds not meant to be forgotten, but meant to remind us that we survived. And sometimes, the light we've been searching for all along lies right in the trembling hands that carried us through. Thank you for journeying with me to the end of this story. If it touched you in any way, a lesson, an emotion, a moment that made you stop and think, please share it with someone who may need to hear it. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and if you want to continue exploring more deep, life-changing stories, you are warmly invited to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. See you in the following story of Deep Life Tales.